So I also want to start with a territorial acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge the unceded, occupied, and stolen territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. That's where I'm joining you from today, and that's where this work that I'm going to be talking about today was undertaken. All of the photos in this presentation were taken by my young collaborators many years ago now. And this particular photo was taken by one of the many young Indigenous people who I've worked with over the years, who unfortunately is not with us anymore. These young people have generously shared their time and stories with me, and I want to express my gratitude to these teachers as a white settler and visitor on these lands. Oops. I usually show this slide at the end of my presentations, but somehow it's feeling more and more important to show it at the beginning, along with a territorial acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge the thousands of young people who have died as a result of overdoses due to the toxic drug supply in what we now know as British Columbia and Canada. This unfortunately includes many of the young people involved in the work that I'm going to present on today. And I want to say that I miss these young people and I remember them. And presenting this work today is a part of remembering them and remembering and honoring their contribution to my research. So the ideas in this presentation today are developed in two places. One is my forthcoming book. Of course, this is a bit of shameless self-promotion. I have a book coming out next month, which charts 15 years of immersed fieldwork with young people who use drugs in the context of entrenched poverty, unstable housing and homelessness, and other experiences of structural oppression in Metro Vancouver, including many young couples navigating pregnancies and parenting. Today's presentation also draws from a paper we published earlier this year, co-authored by a number of different people, but I especially want to acknowledge Reith Charlesworth, who did a beautiful master's project on this topic. And I also want to acknowledge our young co-author on this paper, Sarah West, who I worked with for well over a decade on research. And it was especially exciting to have Sarah join us as a co-author on this paper after so many conversations about these topics over the years. I just want to note that the stories of young people that I present today actually come from this paper and from Reith's ethnography, while the concepts that I'm going to discuss are elaborated in both the book and the paper. Young people who use drugs in the context of entrenched poverty and unstable housing and homelessness often view pregnancy as an event that can meaningfully alter the trajectories of their lives. Many envision pregnancy as a time when they should reduce or eliminate substance use, secure more stable forms of housing and steadier access to income, and seek out and solidify crucial forms of support, including social support. In this way, young people's perspectives often seem to converge with those of the various professionals in their lives, who also identify pregnancy as a strategic window of opportunity to make these kinds of significant changes. Despite this convergence, desired changes in young people's lives are often not realized. Instead, pregnancy and early parenting can catalyze numerous harms for structurally vulnerable young parents, including child apprehension, periods of mental health crisis, drug use relapse, binging and overdose, street-based homelessness, and disengagement from services. These harms, as I will show, can be powerfully gendered and, of course, are racialized in our context. And they're particularly alarming in the context of the current North American overdose or drug toxicity crisis. Today, I want to talk about how young people's romantic relationships powerfully shape what they believe is right and wrong in particular moments during pregnancy and early parenting, and how they ultimately navigate the demands of child protection, criminal justice, substance use treatment, and healthcare systems across time. I'll describe how interventions which separate young couples are often experienced by young people as destabilizing the already fragile material, emotional, and moral worlds they have built for themselves. They undermine the very thing, their romantic relationships, that they view as essential to successfully navigating pregnancies, creating families, and building different kinds of lives. Professionals in young people's lives often focus on the harms generated by their romantic relationships. Alternatively, research has demonstrated that romantic relationships formed in contexts of profound marginalization, such as entrenched poverty and homelessness, are often crucial sources of material and emotional support, as well as sources of pain, violence, and instability. I argue that understandings of romantic relationships as either positive or negative, or even as positive and negative influences on young people's trajectories, do not fully account for the ways that these unions powerfully shape outcomes of pregnancy and early parenting in our and other similar settings. I follow anthropologist Jarrett Zygon in suggesting that romantic relationships are better conceptualized as moral assemblages, composed of multiple and shifting understandings, experiences, and desires, as well as embodied dispositions shaped by individual and collective histories. And if that sounds like a lot, I'm going to elaborate on that over the course of this presentation. As moral assemblages, romantic relationships open up particular ethical ways of being in the world. Importantly, they come to issue unavoidable demands for particular kinds of action in particular moments, including moments of decision-making surrounding how to navigate pregnancy and early parenting in a context of entrenched poverty, unstable housing and homelessness, and substance use. Viewed through this lens, we are able to better understand moments when young people's decision-making clashes with and is powerfully undermined by the mandates of healthcare, criminal justice, and child protection systems, even when there are shared goals. In our setting, of course, the histories that come to shape romantic relationships as moral assemblages frequently include experiences of chronic residential and caregiver instability and loss of family and community that stretch across young people's own childhoods and across generations. These histories also include repeated negative interactions with healthcare, criminal justice, and child protection professionals, services, and systems. For Indigenous young people, these experiences across time and place must be understood as forms of ongoing and intergenerational colonial violence. Following Indigenous scholar Eve Tuck, though, in my long-term work, I always want to both acknowledge the disproportionate harms experienced by the Indigenous young people I've worked with at the hands of contemporary systems and services that continue to be rife with racism and white supremacy, and move beyond these kinds of damage-centered narratives to foreground young Indigenous people's desires for love, family, self-determination, and different kinds of futures. I hope I'm able to do that today despite this very difficult subject matter. And I just want to flag that towards the end of the presentation, suicide is mentioned as part of one young person's story. So please take good care and make the decision that's right for you in terms of participating in this talk. The young people who have been involved in my research over the years often describe spending every moment with their romantic partners. They almost always view their romantic partners as family. They frequently declare, both in person and on Facebook, that they are married, even if this is not the case legally. They wear matching rings and graffiti the walls of their rooms and the places where they sleep with declarations of love and long-term commitment. Young people's moral worlds are powerfully anchored by their romantic relationships, and they have spent a great deal of time talking to me, as well as members of my team, over the years about what kinds of behaviors are right and wrong in the context of romantic relationships. Pregnancy is an event that can further ignite these moral worlds, binding young people even more tightly to each other as family and reinforcing ideas about right and wrong behaviors in these contexts. 23-year-old Dylan described his attachment to his girlfriend Amanda's pregnancy and his fierce commitment to being a good father. He recalled, every time Amanda would be sleeping, I would always just stay up all night and talk to him, his unborn child. And he would kick back, and then I would tell him that I was really, really excited for him to come, to be born, and that I would be a really, really great father and everything. And then he would always kick back. It was really great. As moral assemblages composed of multiple and shifting understandings, experiences, and desires, romantic relationships include gendered notions of how a young man or gender diverse partner who identifies themselves as the primary provider should take care of a pregnant partner, carrying possessions and setting up outdoor shelters, putting names down for shelter beds, obtaining food, clothes, and in some cases, drugs, providing protection while a pregnant partner is sleeping or generating income, etc. Many young people frame this provider role, so that's a word that they often use, the word provider, as the most important priority in their lives during a partner's pregnancy. Gendered notions of how a young person should support and provide for a pregnant partner intersect with certain embodied dispositions, or things known at the level of the body and not necessarily as a part of conscious thought. For example, gendered notions can intersect with embodied dispositions shaped by the everyday emergencies of poverty, homelessness, and addiction. The constant need to procure material resources and to navigate regular threats and incidents of violence and engagement in risky income generation strategies, frenetic cycles of drug procurement and use, etc. As part of moral assemblages, these gendered notions and embodied dispositions powerfully shape understandings of right and wrong and decision-making surrounding pregnancy and parenting. Young men, young women, and gender-diverse young people often declare that a couple must stay together no matter what throughout pregnancy, childbirth, and early parenting to protect, provide for, and love each other. This seems to be especially important to couples who have experienced chronic caregiver and residential instability and child protection services involvement during their own childhoods, as both Dylan and Amanda had. A commitment to staying together no matter what often clashes with the imperatives of healthcare, criminal justice, and child protection systems, which frequently mandate a period of separation for young couples during pregnancy and early parenting. Among young people with recent histories of or ongoing substance use, as they are also navigating pregnancies, child protection social workers often dictate that one or both romantic partners attend residential treatment if they want to maintain custody of their child following birth. Due to the lack of residential treatment options that allow young couples to attend together, a decision to attend residential treatment is also often a decision to separate for a period of time. When faced with the dilemma of whether or not to separate for a period of time, many young people decide that what is right for them is to stay together, even as professionals issue stern warnings that doing so will mean child protection services involvement and most likely losing custody of a child. Young people have often expressed tremendous frustration and a painful sense of confusion regarding the ways that social workers, law enforcement, and other professionals seem to actively work to, quote, break couples apart and, quote, do nothing to keep families together, Because from their perspective, this separation is morally wrong. For example, Dylan told us that when Amanda accessed a residential treatment program for pregnant women late in her pregnancy, the outreach workers there strongly encouraged him to access a different residential treatment program in anticipation of their child's birth. But Dylan's assessment of the situation was different. He said, I didn't want to leave her because what if she needed me? Before she was pregnant, we were homeless. And then while she was pregnant, we were homeless. And through those 3 years, she really couldn't rely on anyone except me. And she knew that I was the only one that was there for her and would always be there for her. And I was always willing to help her, no matter what. And that was when our relationship was the best. 26-year-old Elijah described a thought process that was remarkably similar to Dylan's. In this case, it was a restraining order that prevented him from seeing his partner, Kaylee, who was 5 months pregnant at the time. And I just want to note that Kaylee did not agree with the restraining order, but nevertheless, it was put in place for a number of reasons. Elijah's parole officer told him that he must complete some form of substance use treatment before a court date in order for the restraining order to be lifted. But he had decided not to go and continued to see Kaylee despite the restraining order. He recalled, it's just that I would have been trapped inside for 2 weeks, that's in a residential treatment program, when my girlfriend needs me right now. It's hard to do that when she's pregnant and she needs me. Like, I'm pretty sure I'll go back to treatment when she doesn't, but I've never left her side for 3 years, besides the 3 months I was in jail. All of the young people I've worked with over the years whose pregnancies ended with the birth of their child became parents under the inspecting gaze of Child Protection Services. This surveillance took the form of supervision orders issued by social workers that restricted contact between young people and their children and partner, and child apprehensions. Consistent with a large body of previous research, including work done at this center, the event of child apprehension was almost always described by young people as abrupt and traumatic, often leading to periods of mental health crisis, substance use relapses and binging, and the breakdown of romantic relationships. Alarmingly, we've observed that many young people are offered no mental health or other forms of support in the immediate aftermath of child apprehension. Instead, young people almost always frame their interactions with the social workers who are in charge of their and their children's files as overwhelmingly negative, painfully confusing, and for many Indigenous young people, shaped by discrimination against those who were, as one Indigenous woman put it, low income and Native. Young couples consistently use language like, they are purposely sabotaging us, to describe their relationship with Child Protection Services social workers, who, as described earlier, frequently mandate periods of separation, thereby undermining the very thing that anchors young people's fragile material, emotional, and moral worlds. For example, Dylan was under a supervision order immediately following his child's birth, which prevented him from visiting Amanda or their child without professional supervision until he secured housing and employment. So those were 2 conditions given to him by the social worker. Without Amanda's support, however, finding housing and a job seemed utterly impossible to Dylan. Overwhelmed by the situation, he began avoiding meetings and his social worker altogether. A year later, he identified the supervision order as the catalyst for Amanda ending their relationship. He recalled, when we had the social workers show up in our life, we were together and we were in love with each other and we wanted to stay with each other. But then by the time the social workers left, they basically broke us apart. They basically made her hate me, and they basically made her not want to be with me. It's like the whole supervision order broke us apart. Despite the various ways that young couples are separated from each other and their children, I want to note that I've observed, and other members of my team have observed, that many young people continue to communicate with romantic partners and see children secretly if they can, risking further legal consequences and separation. So that's something that both Dylan and Elijah undertook, despite significant risks. Young people like Dylan, Amanda, Elijah, and Kaylee must navigate multiple crushing forms of loss, including the loss of their child or children to the system, the loss of romantic partners, and the loss of family. They must also navigate various forms of defeat. Young people are most often offered support in the form of substance use treatment, whether beds or opioid agonist therapy and other outpatient programs. However, almost all of the young people and couples I have worked with over time indicate, not surprisingly, that it is stable housing, employment, and income support that they most desperately need to create a home for their child or children and family. Unfortunately, young people continue to receive little institutional support in accessing these. And I think many of us here moreover, the various mechanisms that stabilize their already fragile material, emotional, and moral worlds, frequently sending them into chaos. Recall that Dylan was told by his social worker that he had to secure housing and employment before he would be allowed to see Amanda and his child. In the absence of institutional but also intimate partner support, Dylan experienced challenges in accessing even low barrier work programs. He was enrolled in at least 3 programs like this, but either stopped attending or was kicked out. Dylan also struggled with complicated administrative processes involved in accessing low barrier housing. At one point, he was living in supportive housing, but was then evicted and became homeless again. He became increasingly despondent as he attempted to navigate poverty, homelessness, substance use, and the various expectations his social worker had set out for him in order to be reconnected with Amanda and see his child. As he summarized, I asked Amanda the other day, I was like, do you honestly see a possibility of us ever being reunited as a family? Honestly. Like, that's all I've been stressing about lately. And I just want to know if I should keep going, trying to be motivated at this, or if I should just give up because, like, I don't know which way it's going to go. I'm just feeling too overwhelmed. I'm feeling too exhausted, honestly. I just can't seem to get out of bed for anything. I just hate it. It's just not what I expected I had to go through to be a parent. Like, all I ever wanted was to have a family. A year before he said this, Dylan had talked about how he longed to be an actual dad for his son, unlike the role his own father had played in his life. A year later, it seemed to Dylan that this desire was hopelessly out of reach. Dylan was not aware of any mental health or other supports that he could access to help him manage the multiple losses and overwhelming sense of defeat that he was experiencing. Instead, he told us that he turned to what he referred to as unhealthy coping outlets, namely the intensive use of alcohol, crystal methamphetamine, and fentanyl. For many Indigenous young people, cycles of loss, defeat, and harm at the hands of the system are deepened by intergenerational trauma, the intergenerational trauma of settler colonialism and related forms of violence. Dylan, Amanda, Elijah, and Kaylee all identify as Indigenous. Shortly after the birth of his child, Dylan was attempting to manage yet another of his social worker's expectations that he attend residential treatment, while also dealing with the disappearance of his sister. At this time, there continued to be immense public pressure on the Canadian government to investigate the overwhelming number of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls that has long been an issue across the country and a national inquiry was underway to investigate the systemic causes of this violence. The stress of his sister's disappearance led Dylan to leave a treatment program early. A short time later, Dylan learned that his sister had died by suicide. When the National Inquiry's final report was published a year later, it concluded that the various forms of violence experienced by Indigenous women and girls, including suicide, are shaped by colonial oppression. Dylan said that he did not receive any mental health or other kinds of support to help him deal with this trauma, which compounded the loss of his child and romantic partner that he was also contending with at this time. It's not possible for us to know whether help was offered or whether Dylan, like so many others, felt like he didn't know how to ask for help or where help might come from. After leaving treatment early and then learning about the death of his sister, Dylan became significantly re-entrenched in homelessness and intensive meth and fentanyl use. Under the weight of historical, structural, and institutional pressures, and without intimate partner support from Amanda, being a good father seemed increasingly out of reach. This work reveals a critical disjuncture between youth's desires, decision-making, and moralities, and interventions by healthcare, criminal justice, and child protection systems. This disjuncture too often results in child custody loss and numerous related harms. Interventions that separate young couples are often experienced by young people as destabilizing already fragile material, emotional, and moral worlds with disastrous consequences. These interventions undermine the very thing, young people's romantic relationships, that they view as a source of their power in the world, for some perhaps their primary source of power. Systems and services are therefore not just experienced as fragmented and punitive, something that we can read a lot about in the literature, but as actively working against young couples, even when, from their perspective, they are trying or actively doing the right thing. The result is this painful sense of frustration and confusion, as well as these cycles of loss, defeat, and harm. The cycles of loss, defeat, and harm that young people are experiencing often extend both across their own lives and intergenerationally. During her pregnancy, it's worth noting that Amanda received valuable, albeit time-limited support from specialized community-based and residential services for pregnant women. And we know that there are quite a few very progressive and comprehensive programs for pregnant women in Vancouver. However, even these comprehensive and progressive services offer little to no support to the partners of pregnant individuals or to couples. Consequently, although Dylan and Elijah were highly focused on becoming good fathers, it was framed in many moments as the most important role in their lives. They often experienced a sense of erasure, as well as significant harms when their partners were drawn into women-only programs, leaving them isolated. At other times, Dylan and Elijah were more forcibly excluded from their partners and children's lives via no contact and supervision orders, and in Elijah's case, a restraining order. A significant lack of services dedicated to romantic couples and parents who are not mothers perpetuates assumptions that women are the natural bearers of responsibility when it comes to pregnancy and parenting. It can place strain on co-parenting dynamics and a greater burden of responsibility on young women. Gendered programming aimed at mothers also upholds heteronormative ideas of family that exclude gender diverse and queer youth. The bottom line is we must find ways to work with diverse young couples and families who are navigating pregnancy and early parenting, even as these relationships are often highly tumultuous and can certainly be the source of harms. In the context of this work, many of the young people that I've worked with and who have worked with members of my team indicated that they would have attended residential treatment and probably stayed longer if they could have done so as a couple. The research that I'm talking about today also amplifies existing urgent calls for public policy remedies that extend beyond healthcare interventions and encompass children and families. There is a dire lack of low barrier supportive family housing for young people, young couples, and young families, including family housing for Indigenous young people. In the absence of family programs that include or are aimed at young people, many of those who we've worked with have made the decision not to attend residential treatment at all or left residential treatment early to reconnect with their romantic partners and, in some cases, children. Designing family treatment and housing programs that are more congruent with diverse young people's own understandings, experiences, desires, and moralities are crucial aspects of dismantling racism, white supremacy, and other forms of structural oppression that systematically disadvantage Indigenous and other young people in our context. In collaborating with Indigenous peoples, nations, and organizations, and others, to develop and redesign equity-oriented family housing, treatment, and social interventions, we must center and respond to the ways that settler colonialism, systemic racism, white supremacy, and other oppressive forces influence the health and wellness of young people who are navigating pregnancy and early parenting in the context of entrenched poverty, homelessness and unstable housing, and criminalized substance use. Thank you very much. I'll just quickly acknowledge my funders and institutions, and also provide my contact information, which is easily available online. And I welcome your emails with further questions if we aren't able to get to all of them in the discussion now. Thank you very much.
Lisa writes, you mentioned so many systemic barriers imposed by social workers and child protection services. Has your team both put forth related policy briefs, increasing residential treatment, opportunities for families, repealing supervision orders, etc.? So really a question of like, how have you been, you make some very, very strong suggestions, and wondering, yeah, I guess, have you been able to bring them forward in different policy realms and also at the programmatic level?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Lisa, for that question. This paper just came out earlier this year, and it's a little bit unfortunate that we had just put out a Youth Voices on Treatment report at the end of last year, which unfortunately, so that's a report co-authored with young people who use drugs that has been quite widely distributed across the province and is being taken up by different levels of government. But unfortunately, this work is not in there, which is a real missed opportunity, and really comes down to, well, it's one missed opportunity because it's really focused on that treatment piece, and we could have certainly included a call for more programs for couples and families in terms of our residential treatment programs. So that was a missed opportunity. I think where we're at with this work is, really trying to mobilize it now in different conversations that are happening with different levels of government, but we don't thus far have a policy brief that includes this work. So that may be something that we need to think about if we are finding it challenging to bring this work into discussions. What we noticed with the Youth Voices on Treatment report, that was all based on different published papers that we'd done. But once we had it in that packaged report, it became a much greater part of the conversation. So I think that we may need to do that with this as well, possibly combining it with other work that we're doing around housing and other areas that would be a fit here.
Thanks so much, Danya. And so interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about like how, for example, the the recommendation for youth-focused treatment, like how that was received. What were some of the challenging discussions that were happening at the policy level in the context of that report?
Yeah, well, I mean, one place where we've been having this conversation, we just sort of started. I've been having this conversation with some physicians at BC Children's Hospital, for example, about, you know, couples being able to work on their substance use together, but also families being able to work on their substance use together. So we not infrequently have a situation where you know, biological parents or adoptive parents are expressing a desire to work on their substance use, and their children are also expressing that desire. And sometimes those children are navigating pregnancies and early parenting, as I described in this presentation. So we have started those conversations around what would it look like to support families together? What would it look like to support, you know, couples together? But I feel like these conversations are in an incredibly early stage, because the idea of separating, you know, separating couples, going into treatment separately is such a pervasive philosophy or discourse in the treatment world, right? This idea that you avoid people, places, and things that are triggering. Well, what could be more triggering than that romantic partner or even that parent who, you know, you've been using with very intensively for perhaps, you know, a number of years? That's a pretty pervasive belief built into our treatment system, if we can call it that. So this idea of, you know, what if we engaged young couples? What if we engaged family? That's a pretty significant shift from this thinking of avoiding people, places, and things that could be triggering. So I think we're at a really early stage with this. I'm just seeing Lisa's follow-up comment here. And we actually have talked to quite a few social workers. We actually have some work that we're just writing up right now about how social workers can work with like the family members of these young people. So, you know, biological and adoptive parents, chosen family, and romantic partners. And so we have actually looked at the social worker perspective on that and have that work forthcoming. We hope to submit it by the end of this year. And that was interesting because it really did show that social workers feel very apprehensive and very ill-equipped to work with couples and to work with families. That the social workers that we talked to, a number of them recognized the benefits of doing that and said even that they might want to do that, but they also felt like they didn't have the training, the time, the space to be able to undertake that incredibly challenging work. So because we have that piece forthcoming, Lisa, you're just making me think about this, like how could we maybe package this work in terms of a policy brief? Maybe what makes sense is to bring together these two pieces to say, you know, here's the perspective from young people, and here's where we've talked to social workers about doing this really challenging work with couples and families. And we can see that, you know, this is like, I don't want to imply for one second that this is some of the most challenging work, I think, that we can undertake in this area of providing care and support. It's very tricky because romantic relationships are a source of harms. You know, they can be a source of violence, they can be a source of instability, but then they're also at the very center of young people's moral worlds, as I talked about. So doing this work is tricky. And what we saw when we talked to social workers was those that had a tremendous amount of experience and felt really comfortable improvising and changing course and being very, very nimble with young people and young couples and families were having some success. And then we heard from other social workers, you know, I'd love to be able to do that. I don't feel like I have those skills or the time and the space.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great idea, combining those two papers as a policy brief to provide like these different perspectives as well. And then there's another question from Derek. Derek is wondering if you could speak to the experience of same-sex couples as well, either from your own work and your own research, or from other people's research that you know of.
Derek, that's a great question. And I have to say that I haven't worked with a same-sex couple navigating pregnancy and early parenting. When I think of the couples that I've worked with that are not cisgender heterosexual couples, it's gender diverse and transgender young people in relationships with other young people of a whole range of different identities who are navigating these kinds of issues. So I can't speak to that. And I think that, when we were doing this work, and especially when we wrote up the paper, but it certainly applies to my book as well, we identified this as a crucial area for further research, because we really have not delved into that area, same-sex couples navigating pregnancy and early parenting. But that is, an area where more work certainly needs to be done, because we need these programs that we're thinking about to work for diverse young people, and not just for cisgender heterosexual couples.
All right. Yeah. Are there?
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
I was just going to ask if there were any more questions. I think we have a little bit more time.
I was just going to say that if anybody knows of other people's work, I mean, my work really focuses on this context of multiple intersecting forms of marginalization and structural oppression. So working with young people navigating entrenched poverty and unstable housing and homelessness. And I'm not aware of research in that area on same-sex couples navigating pregnancy and early parenting. But even if there's work, other work that could be relevant to think with, I'd love it if Derek or others wanted to put that in the chat.
Danya, it just also and my apologies, for some reason I might not be able to see all the questions in the chat, but there's another question from Rasheen in the chat that I was just made aware of. So sorry about that. And I was going to ask you this one too. Can you briefly speak to your, so Rasheen is wondering if you could briefly speak to your methodology and participant selection, self-selection a little bit more. I know you could speak for 2 hours on that, but yes, if you can give us a little bit of a teaser about your methodology, because I know it's really innovative and you're extremely involved over a very long period of time as well.
Yeah, so as I said, the work that I presented today is elaborated in two places. One is my book, and that's where I really talk about these young people who I came to know in late 2007, 2008, 2009. I got to know them largely through spending time at a frontline research office located in the downtown south or west end of Vancouver, and also through a research assistant that I had for a small period of time, who was himself kind of had one foot in the local drug scenes in downtown Vancouver and one foot out. So he introduced me to various people and places for a period of about, I think, a few months. It was a really long time ago now. And then as I got to know young people, both at that field office and through that research assistant, and I ended up spending time in the places where young people were living, working, socializing, sleeping, and accessing services and systems, I sort of got to know other young people through that. And that's how I got to know a core group of, I would say, about 30 young people who I worked with for a number of years. Like I said, one of our co-authors on that paper is someone who I met, back in 2009, who I'm still working with now. So I built those relationships over a long period of time. And so as I knew people over years and years, they were navigating multiple moments of pregnancy and early parenting, and as well as child apprehensions. So that's part of what informs my thinking on this, is that really long-term immersed ethnographic work that's rooted in relationships and even friendships with people formed over a long period of time. But actually the work that I presented today, like I said, the stories that I presented today came from my former master's student, Reith Charlesworth's master's project. So Dylan and Amanda and Elijah and Kaylee were part of her ethnographic cohort. And she met them also through the Frontline Research Office, which of course is in a different location than back when I was there in 2007, 2008, 2009. But she also got to know people in that office, had preliminary interviews and conversations with them in that office. And then as she became closer with them and got to know them better, some of them invited her to their homes or the places where they were sleeping. And so it was also that very ethnographic methodology of getting to know people, and then upon their invitation, spending time with them in those places where they're living, working, sleeping, and accessing services and systems.
Thank you so much, Danya. We have 5 more minutes, or maybe there's one other question in the Q&A, and it's from Angel, and Angel is wondering, if we talk about feminism, how can I connect your findings or your work with feminism, being a young parent and staying together?
That's a tough question. I'm not sure. Yeah, I feel like I really focused in this presentation on the perspectives of young fathers. Actually, I was very focused on those gendered expectations, although as I noted, we also work with gender diverse young people who very firmly identify themselves as a provider. And so some of those gender norms, certainly extend beyond self-identified fathers. If I'm connecting then to feminism, by no means am I an expert. I would defer to others who I'm sure have much more expertise in this area, but I would think about how the erasure of fathers and gender diverse young people from some of even these most progressive and comprehensive services ultimately can really hurt self-identified young women and mothers as well. So I think, if we're thinking about uplifting self-identified young women and young mothers, we need to look at this broader picture in terms of the gendered moral worlds that young people are inhabiting. And we really need to think about how to work with couples, not just with the pregnant partner, but with both people who are part of the couple. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's my thought at the moment. Andrea, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I think those are really thoughtful comments, and another layer of complexity that needs to kind of be woven into service provision for everybody, for all, the parents and the families that that you've been working with, or young families that face substance use issues and other issues around housing and so on. Yeah, well, I do know the time, so I want to thank you again, Danya, for this really thought-provoking and important work, and for this presentation. I think it's really beautiful to see your work, how it connects, how you use your methodology, and then how you connect those stories and experience of the young parents to some very concrete policy suggestions or changes that could really support these young families. So with that, I just want to let everybody know that our next session is on November 15th, same time at noon. We'll be welcoming Dr. A.J. Lowick to speak on troubling the taken for granted gender and sex in health research. Registration is open now. And thanks again for joining us today. If you would like to see more events like this, check our website and follow us on the social media channels. You can also sign up for our newsletter using the link on the screen. So thanks, everybody, and I hope you have a good rest of your afternoon. Take care. Bye.